So welcome, friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitudes Center Zoom session with our special guest today, my friend Kazu Haga, on Dr. King's North Star. So again, let me remind everybody to mute yourselves and to write any questions you have or comments or share anything in the chat box there. I'm hoping Kazu will speak to us for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments and reflections. And in a few days from now, I'll send out the Zoom recording link if you missed it or you want to listen again. So Kazu, what we'd like to do is we begin with a little prayer, and then I'll introduce you, and then the floor will be yours. So let's begin with a little prayer, and I invite us into a moment of silence. And if you would like to enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you, and we welcome the radical nonviolent Jesus into our circle. And let's just take a moment to ask for all the graces of peace and love for ourselves and for our poor world. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and peace and love that you give us. Be with us now and bless us as we reflect with our friend Kazu on Dr. King's 6 principles of nonviolence. And you're called to be people of nonviolence, to work for racial, social, economic, and climate justice, to work for the abolition of racism, poverty, war, nuclear weapons, the digging up of fossil fuels, and all systemic violence and injustice, that we might be your holy people of universal love and creative nonviolence, your beatitude people, your beloved daughters and sons, your holy peacemakers. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'm so happy to be here with our friend, reflecting on the teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. and how we can live them out today in our troubled times. You know, the way Kazu and I look at Dr. King is that he taught and modeled relentless, persistent, active, creative nonviolence. And I would add, as the only way to follow Jesus in this world of total violence. And early on, certainly in his first book, Dr. King outlined 6 guiding principles of nonviolence, which he lived throughout his public life and work. And they've gone on to inspire millions of people, not only in the civil rights movement, but in countless other movements of liberation around the world. Kazu Haga is a young activist from Oakland, California, and a few years ago, he published a brilliant book, which I want everyone to get. I hope you all get. I hope you can see it. It's called Healing Resistance, a Radically Different Response to Harm. And Kazu used Dr. King's 6 principles of nonviolence as a new, fresh way to look at our own lives of becoming people of nonviolence. So I'm really happy to welcome Kazu today to talk with us about his book and the 6 principles. In short, Kazu is a practitioner, trainer, and teacher of nonviolence and restorative justice and mindfulness. He works with incarcerated people, with young people, and with activists around the country. He's the founder of the East Point Peace Academy and a core member of the Ahimsa Collective and the Fierce Vulnerability Network. He has over 20 years of experience in nonviolence and social change work. And so I'm really happy to welcome him to the Beatitudes Center. And so, dear friends, please join me in giving a round of applause, silent applause, to Kazu Haga. Kazu, the floor is yours to tell us about Dr. King's North Stars. You're very welcome here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be here and spend a little bit of time with you this morning for me, afternoon for maybe some of you. I want to start by sharing just a little bit of my story and how I came to know Dr. King, the real Dr. King. If you've read my book, a lot of this will be review, but when I was 17 years old, I was at a place in my life where I was really lost. I had dropped out of high school when I was 15. There was a lot of violence happening in my home that I was trying to run away from. And, I always tell people that at that age, if I had met a military recruiter, I would have gone to war. And if I would have gone off to war, who knows, right? Like I could have come back with PTSD and ended up as a police officer or a prison guard or any one of these these paths. And if I lived in a large urban city, I might have joined a gang, and I might have ended up in prison rather than working as a prison guard. Life is a really interesting thing. These small moments in our lives can really drastically alter our lives. And for me, luckily, it wasn't a military recruiter that I met. It was a group of Buddhist monks and nuns from Japan, from a Buddhist order called Nipponzan Hoji, who is a Buddhist order that's really committed to nonviolence and social change work. And they were organizing a walking pilgrimage. They were going to walk from Massachusetts down the coast to New Orleans and then down the coast of Africa to retrace the slave route and to begin to try to reverse the legacy of enslavement and the impact that it's had on this country. And so I was bored. I had nothing better to do. I told my mom I would check it out for a week, and I left home for a year and a half. Ended up walking all the way to New Orleans with them, and then spending a year living overseas in their monasteries throughout India and Nepal. And so that was my introduction to Buddhism. It was my introduction to activism. It was my introduction to nonviolence, where it was always at this intersection of spiritual practice and social action. And when I came home from that experience, I got involved in community organizing right away, mainly through the anti-globalization movement of the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And that's when I started kind of earning my chops as a nonviolence trainer. I started giving nonviolence trainings in preparation for these large demonstrations, the School of Americas, the IMF World Bank protests, these kinds of things. And I really enjoyed doing them, but about a year or a year and a half into my kind of passion as a nonviolence trainer, I remember this one training that I did, actually with Jo Comerford. Bruce, you just mentioned her name. Jo Comerford, who used to be the coordinator of the AFSC in Western Massachusetts. We had just got done doing a day-long nonviolence training. It went really well. But at the end of it, we were having this conversation and we were saying, we're feeling like something is deeply missing in the conversations that we're having in these trainings. Like there's some depth that we know is there that we're not able to access. And I couldn't name it at the time, but it was strong enough of an intuition that I stopped doing these trainings. And for the next 10 years or so, all I did was social change work. But the word nonviolence wasn't something that I associated with in any real way. But 10 years later, in 1997, I ended up taking this 2-day workshop in a philosophy called Kingian Nonviolence Conflict Reconciliation that was developed out of the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King. And those 2 days just completely changed my life. This was 11 or 12 years into my life as an activist, where that's all I've been doing is social change work. At that point, I thought I had some idea of who Dr. King was, and some idea of what this word nonviolence meant. And in that sense, those 2 days were incredibly humbling, right? I realized that I had no idea who Dr. King was and no idea what the word nonviolence meant. And it's interesting because, Dr. King is viewed as this national icon and hero, and we celebrate Martin Luther King Day, and you go to McDonald's and get little booklets about who Dr. King was on Black History Month. And I realized that we do such a disservice to his legacy and to ourselves by not really understanding who Dr. King was and what he preached. During that 2-day training, I realized that what was missing in the trainings that I was doing back then in the early 2000s were these principles, right? It was like the trainings that I was doing back then, it wasn't nonviolence trainings, it was nonviolence civil disobedience trainings. And that's a really important aspect of nonviolence. But for so many of us, the word nonviolence just becomes an adjective that describes the absence of physical violence when engaged in political organizing work. And if that's our understanding of nonviolence, I always say that you can make the argument that the Ku Klux Klan practices nonviolence when they organize their marches. Because at least while they're organizing their marches, they're not throwing Molotov cocktails, right? But to me, I can never view a KKK march as being nonviolent. And it was really through understanding these Kingian principles that I began to understand what the word nonviolence meant in a much more holistic level. And so I want to share some slides with you to briefly go over these 6 principles as I've come to understand them. Give me 1 second here. And I'll talk about them for a little bit of time, and then we'll open it up for some conversations with everyone. But like John mentioned, these 6 principles were kind of first started to come into public consciousness when Dr. King wrote or edited, co-wrote the Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, which was one of his more famous essays that he was asked to write at the end of the Montgomery bus boycott. And the principles, I'll share my thoughts on them for the next 40 minutes or so, but ultimately these principles are something that I've been trying to understand better for the better part of 10 years, more than 10 years. And it's something that you can continue to deepen in more and more. So, these next 40 minutes will just be a tip of the iceberg. And I imagine many of you are also familiar with these principles as well. So these are the 6 principles, and we'll spend a little bit of time going over each of them. Starting with principle number 1, which is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. There's a couple of elements to this principle. First is that nonviolence is a way of life, right? And again, this is something that I really didn't understand early in my career as an activist, is that nonviolence isn't a switch that you turn on when you go to a demonstration, and then you turn off that switch when you leave the demonstration, or when you're in the organizing meetings, organizing the demonstration. But there's also a really different understanding of nonviolence that Dr. King really helped me understand. And I want to share that by doing this little activity. Just, you don't have to say it out loud, but just what do you notice as the difference between these 2 images? We all play these games as children in newspapers and things like that. Just take a couple seconds, seeing if you can find, I think there's like 6 or 7 differences. So I don't know if you can see all of them. The mouth of the pig is a little bit open. The color of his suspenders is slightly different. The reflection on the window. Here's another one. What's the difference between these 2 words? And obviously the difference is the hyphen, right? And again, many of you may be familiar with this, but oftentimes I see the word nonviolence written with the hyphen and without the hyphen and they're interchangeable, right? Most people think that whether you write it with the hyphen, whether you write it without the hyphen, it really doesn't make a difference. But from a Kingian perspective, it makes all the difference in the world. When you put the hyphen in the word, it actually drastically changes the meaning of the word. When you put a hyphen in the word, it essentially separates the word, right? And it turns it into 2 words, non-hyphen violence. And all that says is something is not violent. Something is the absence of violence. And I always argue that the biggest and most dangerous misunderstanding of the word nonviolence is when people think that nonviolence is about not being violent. That as long as I'm not being violent, as long as I'm not throwing a punch, then I'm practicing nonviolence. And I think it's a very dangerous misunderstanding of the word. And I'll share a couple of stories about why. This is an image of the intersection of the view out of the window of the apartment that I used to live in. I just moved out of it a little over a year ago, but I lived in this apartment for 12, 13 years. So I sat at my kitchen table and watched this view for many, just countless hours. I lived in a neighborhood called Funktown in Oakland, where it's a neighborhood that struggles with a lot of challenges. And so people yelling and arguing and fighting would be almost a daily occurrence. About 10 years ago, I was taking a nap and I was woken up by a commotion outside. And this couple were arguing with each other and they were yelling at each other. And because this was such a common occurrence where I lived, I was just trying to ignore it and go back to sleep. But this argument kept getting louder and louder and louder. And finally, I decided to get out of my bed and look down the window. And there was a woman on the ground who was getting beat. and she was screaming for help. So I jumped up out of my bed and I put on my shoes. I ran downstairs and opened up the gate. And by this point, they had gone across the street to the other corner that you can see in this picture here. And it was still going on. And so I ran across the street and I managed to break up this fight. Now, it took me a little while to get down there, right? Because I was in bed. By the time I had gotten down there, about 15 of my neighbors had heard the commotion. And they had all come outside and they were just gathered outside watching this go down, not doing anything to help. And I always argue that all of my neighbors who were just watching this violence happen, not doing anything to help, were practicing non-hyphen violence, right? In the sense that they were explicitly not being violent. In fact, if your understanding of nonviolence is limited to, well, as long as I'm not practicing particularly physical forms of violence, then I'm practicing nonviolence, then you could actually make the argument that I was being more violent than my neighbors were, because I did use a limited amount of physical force to separate the two people. And I might have hurt one of them in the process, right? So you can see how big of a misunderstanding we can come to when we understand nonviolence as the absence of something, the absence of violence, right? Nonviolence is not about what not to do, right? Obviously, a commitment to not causing harm is part of it, but so much more than that is it's not about what not to do. It's about when you see violence, when you see injustice in your community, what are you going to do about it? Right? It's a proactive thing about how are you going to put yourself, to interject yourself into a situation of violence and injustice and to try to transform that situation. It's about what you're going to do, not about what you're not going to do. And this misunderstanding of nonviolence also leads to a really dangerous misunderstanding of the concept of peace. This is a picture of one of the many, many unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. This is a picture of a woman named Autherine Lucy, a name who, we hear about Rosa Parks, we hear about Dr. King, we don't really hear about Autherine Lucy. Autherine Lucy was the first Black student ever to enroll in the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. The first day she was on campus, this happened. A riot broke out. The KKK came and burnt a cross on campus. You can see a mob surrounded the car that she was traveling in and people started climbing on top of it. Violence broke out, right? If you can imagine, like, what do you think the school did, the university did to respond to that violence? Because they actually did do something. It wasn't nothing. They did do something. But they responded by expelling Autherine Lucy. They threw her out. They said that you're the reason why this violence is happening. So in order for us to protect the safety of our school, you need to leave. So they threw her out. The next day, because Autherine wasn't on campus anymore, the riots had stopped, right? The violence had stopped. And so the local newspaper ran this headline that said, "Things are quiet in Tuscaloosa today. There is peace on the campus of the University of Alabama." There is peace on the campus of the University of Alabama. And I think most of us would agree that what happened on the campus the next morning wasn't a real peace. And in response to this incident, Dr. King gave one of my all-time favorite sermons. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you Google it. It's really easy to find. The sermon is called "When Peace Becomes Obnoxious." It's only like a page and a half long. And in that sermon, Dr. King talked about what he means when he uses the word peace. And he talked about this concept of negative peace. Negative peace is a term that was originally coined by peace educator Johan Goltang, who's responsible for largely starting the field of peace and conflict studies in higher education. Dr. King said that what happened on the university the next morning wasn't a real peace, that it was a negative peace. He said negative peace is the absence of tension that comes at the expense of justice. And he said things like, "This is the kind of peace that stinks in the nostrils of the Almighty God." And that this is the type of peace that all people of goodwill should be doing everything we can to fight against. So negative peace is quiet and calm that comes at the expense of justice by sweeping issues under the rug, right? Like when we think of peace, we oftentimes think that as long as things are quiet and calm, then it's peaceful. That if someone is screaming in my face, that's not peaceful. So if I punch them in the face and knock them unconscious, they're not screaming at me anymore. It's quiet now because they're not screaming. So did I just create peace? Right? That's a ridiculous way to think about peace building. But because of our gross misunderstanding of peace, this is how we oftentimes go about trying to create peace in our society, right? We go to war because we're taught that if we just kill all the terrorists, then we'll have peace. Mass incarceration. If we just lock up all the bad people, then we'll have peace. The militarization of the police. If all the protesters would just shut up, then we'll have peace, right? This is all because of a gross misunderstanding of what peace actually means. And also this type of negative peace that's very prevalent in a lot of our homes, a lot of places of higher education, a lot of faith communities, to be honest, a lot of nonviolent communities as well. The type of negative peace that comes because we're conflict averse, because we're scared to bring up difficult conversations, right? I was at a conference once and someone called it the tyranny of civility. Like we're all trying to be nice people. We're all trying to be polite. We're all trying to be civil. So we're afraid to bring up issues around conflict and power and injustice. And so we like to pretend that things are peaceful by ignoring the issue. So positive peace then is a process that can look loud and messy, right? Like my family has a lot of negative peace because we experienced a lot of trauma in my early childhood. But because Japanese culture is so conflict averse, we have trouble talking about those issues. And so healing from our childhood trauma requires me bringing up conversations that are really uncomfortable for us to have. And they're really messy for us to have. But that's what peace requires, right? Because we're working towards a world that has justice for all people, that builds towards beloved community, that deals with root causes. This is not a peaceful image. This is an image of children getting hosed during protests in Birmingham during the civil rights movement. While this is not a peaceful image, it may actually be closer to a real positive peace than the image that I shared before of the family having that awkward silence during a holiday dinner, right? This is an image of water protectors fighting the construction of the Line 3 pipeline on sacred indigenous land. It causes disruption because that's oftentimes the point of nonviolence. And it's oftentimes what is required to talk about real peace. The umbrella movement in Hong Kong, right? It causes mass disruption. But also an image like this, which is clearly also not a peaceful image. This is some of what happened after the police killing of, I believe this was after the George Floyd murder. This is not a peaceful image. And, you know, every time something like this happens, it's inevitable that some celebrity, some politician will be quoted saying something along the lines of the protesters need to learn to be peaceful. Like we agree with their message, but they need to learn to be peaceful. And as an advocate and a trainer of nonviolence, I don't think rioting is ever the most strategic or sustainable way to create peace. And at the same time, when people look at images like this and say these young people need to learn to be peaceful, something about it doesn't sit well in my body. And I think it's because I think there needs to be an understanding that this image, this is what happens when you don't give communities peace for 500 years, right? That rioting is oftentimes, as inarticulate as it may be, it is actually a cry for peace from a community who has never had it. These young people are so sick and tired of the violence that they have had to live with in their communities for centuries. And they feel like they have no other recourse, that the violence that they have had to live with for their entire lives and for centuries, for generations, is coming pouring out of them. There's a really beautiful quote from Marshall Rosenberg, who founded Nonviolent Communications, who says, "Violence is the tragic attempt to meet unmet needs." Right? These young people, after centuries of violence, have real legitimate needs to be heard, to be seen, for their pain to be validated, for them to have peace in their lives and in their communities. And because they've never had it, they're using tragic strategies to try to get those needs met. But it's ultimately a cry for peace, a cry for healing. And the last thing that I want to share about this is Dr. King was arrested almost 30 times in his life. And half of those times he was charged by the United States government for disturbing the peace, right? That was the criminal charge. And I always argue that the charge of disturbing the peace should not exist in the United States of America, because this country has never known peace since 1491. So how can you disturb something that doesn't exist in the first place, right? So oftentimes nonviolent activists are charged with disturbing the peace and causing conflict, causing tension. And I think it's important to remember that when we use nonviolence to disturb the peace, we're not disturbing peace, we're disturbing negative peace. We're disturbing complacency. We're disturbing the normalization of violence. So from the outside looking in, nonviolence can oftentimes look like we're causing a disruption. And in some ways we are, but it's important to remember that we're disturbing negative peace, right? We're disturbing the normalization of violence. And that's something that takes incredible courage to do. It's easier to be a bystander. It's easier to witness injustice and say, you know what, that's none of my problem. Someone else will deal with it. But that's not what nonviolence is. Nonviolence is about putting yourself into these situations of harm and trying to do something to bring about positive peace. So nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. That's not to say that people who use violence don't have courage, but I would argue that going into a situation of conflict with a commitment to not retaliate in violence might take a little bit more courage. And so I want to take a little bit of extra time with the first principle, because I think it's really important that we, there's just so many misunderstandings about what nonviolence means. And so much of it is about people believing that nonviolence is about not doing anything and about being a bystander. And so I just wanted to take a little bit of extra time before we move into principle number 2. The beloved community is the framework for the future. The beloved community, especially as John said that I'm a young activist, but I've reached the age where I actually have to take off my glasses to read a book. So I think I'm no longer young. Young is relative, but I don't know if I can claim that. But as a younger activist, I've noticed that the term beloved community is becoming more and more popularized, which is great in a way, but also dangerous, because as words become more and more mainstream, it loses some of its core meaning. Beloved community is a term that was initially coined, my understanding, by a man named Josiah Royce, who was a radical theologian, the founder of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and really popularized by Dr. Martin Luther King. And when I talk to people about the beloved community, people say, oh, well, my church community is my beloved community. My activist community, my friends group is my beloved community. And I think that's partly true. But I always want to challenge people to think deeper, because when Dr. King was talking about beloved community, he actually wasn't talking about the people that he already loves. Right? Building beloved community is not about loving the people that you already love and loving the people that are easy to love. The work of building beloved community is about cultivating love and understanding and compassion and empathy for the people that we do not like, for the people that we see as those people on the other side. the people that we perceive as our enemy, right? To me, a commitment to nonviolence, so much of what is at the heart of it is this commitment to an unwavering understanding of interdependence. That the idea of individual liberation is a delusion and a myth. There is no way for me to become free without also working for the freedom and liberation of all of life. And so there's these two beautiful quotes that I love. One from Dr. Martin Luther King, very famous one, who said, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And then another one from an activist, an Aboriginal Australian activist, Leela Watson, who says, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And these quotes are oftentimes popular in activist communities, but I always question how much people actually believe them. Because I really get the sense that oftentimes when people say justice for all, what we're really meaning is justice for all of my people. And justice for my people is oftentimes comes at the expense of justice for those people. Even in a lot of so-called nonviolent movements, we use nonviolent tactics to gain power, and then we use that power to overpower our opponents. And to me, it's that understanding that we can continue to use power to enforce our will over another group of people that is at the heart of what is destroying our planet. And I always tell people that I think a lot of activists believe that, somehow my liberation is only bound up with the liberation of people that we agree with. That somehow the universe weaves webs of interdependence based on our political affiliation. And that's not how Dharma works. That's not how the laws of the universe works. If we believe that we're interdependent, then we are interdependent with all of life, right? We can't be interdependent just with the people that we want to be interdependent with. That's not how physics works. That's not how the universe works. And the beloved community to me is, I was working in a county jail once, and there was one older incarcerated man who we were talking about, like, is beloved community ever even possible? Is a world without violence ever possible? And he said that, when slaves were on the Underground Railroad, they were walking towards the North Star as their guide. They knew that no matter how far they walked, they were never going to get to the North Star. But they knew that as long as they kept walking in that direction, they would get to where they needed to go. So the point wasn't to get to the North Star, but to use it as a guide. And this incarcerated elder man said that to him, that's what beloved community feels like. Like, we may never get to a world where all people have achieved justice, where there's no systemic forms of violence, but it's still our North Star. It's the thing that we're walking towards, right? So beloved community is not about having this intellectual understanding of whether or not we can ever get there, but it's always our North Star. We're always trying to walk closer and closer in that direction. And in order for us to build this world where there are no opponents, this principle 3 is really important: attack forces of evil, not persons doing evil. Many different ways of talking about this principle. This is a picture of some of my dearest friends and colleagues, some of the most dedicated peacemakers I have ever met in my entire life. I have found that incarcerated people, because they know violence so intimately, are some of the most committed peacemakers I've ever met in my entire life. Like, I have met incarcerated people who have taken other people's lives, who they talk about how they will never cause harm on another being because of the harm that they've caused. And the depth of their commitment in their voice when they talk about this is beyond anything I've ever heard from people outside of prison. And I found, because I've had the privilege to hear so many stories from so many incarcerated people who have taken the lives of other people. that I've developed this theory that if we can pause long enough to slow down and hear people's stories, then everything they do begins to make sense. It's not that it justifies or condones what they do, but it becomes much easier to have compassion for the things that they believe in and the things that they do. And I think these kinds of concepts are easier for us to believe, like for those of us who are advocates of nonviolence, for those of us on the political left. It's easy to look at an image of incarcerated people who are all nonviolence trainers and believe that about these people. But I noticed in a lot of like activist spaces, a lot of militant radical activist spaces, that idea of, oh, maybe if I slow down enough to understand this person's story, it'll be easier for me to have compassion for them. That idea becomes really difficult when the people we're talking about look like this. On the left is Officer Eric Casebolt, who several years ago, his story became viral because he was called to a scene of a pool party in McKinney, Texas, where a bunch of young kids were having this big pool party. And perhaps there were one too many Black kids in a neighborhood that's mostly white hanging out at this pool party. And so some people called the police on the kids. And Officer Casebolt arrived at the scene, and immediately chaos ensued. Officer Casebolt at one point grabbed a young Black woman. I think she was like 14 years old, probably weighed less than 100 pounds, grabbed her by her braids and threw her down to the ground. Another point, Officer Casebolt grabbed his gun, not his taser, but his gun, and started aiming it at young kids who were running around. Now, I believe that Officer Casebolt should have lost his job immediately and have never been able to become a police officer ever again in any jurisdiction. And at the same time, I learned a little bit more about his backstory. It turns out that pool party was the third call that he received that morning as a police officer. The first call that he received was a suicide watch, where he watched a man blow his own brains out in front of his family, in front of the man's family. And not only did he have to clean up the body, but he had to console the family of this man who also watched their husband, their father, commit suicide in front of them. Right after that, he was called to another suicide watch where he had to talk a young woman off a ledge, like from jumping off a ledge and killing herself. And so he said that by the time he got to the pool party, emotionally, he was a wreck. That doesn't justify what he did, but it also speaks to a system of policing that is so violent and didn't care enough about Officer Casebolt's mental health and emotional well-being to give him the rest of the day off after something like that. Like, the culture of policing is one in which you just have to suck it up and move on to the next thing, right? And again, it doesn't justify what Eric Casebolt did, but it speaks to a system of policing that is so violent that it's actually harmful to the police officers as well, right? That the system of policing is so violent that, and it's that system that we need to be attacking, as opposed to believing that there's something inherently wrong and evil about these individuals. The case of Officer Geronimo Yanez is very similar. He's the officer that shot and killed Philando Castile. And you may remember the video of that coming out because Philando Castile's girlfriend shot a video on Facebook Live right after Philando was shot. And one of the things that I remember most deeply about watching that video is Officer Yanez's voice. And it was so obvious to me how scared he was and how, like, it was so obviously not this like intentional act of police officers looking for Black people to shoot and kill, right? Which is oftentimes what I feel like I hear in a lot of circles. And again, nothing will ever justify or condone what he did. But it turns out that Officer Yanez, in the year leading up to that shooting, attended 2 seminars, both of them 2 days long, by a private company called Calibre Press out of Boston. And these seminars are called the Bulletproof Warrior Training. There's these seminars that they go around and do these seminars for police officers. And in the training, they show image after image after image of officers who were killed in the line of duty. And the message is that if you feel threatened even for a split second, if you hesitate to pull the trigger, you might end up on the screen next, right? That's how police officers are being trained. They're trained to be scared, and they're trained to be trigger happy. And so again, is there space for personal accountability for officers Yanez and Cagebolt? 100% yes. But we have to remember that there's a larger system that is at play, and it's that system that we need to learn to be attacking even more. And so the third principle of attack forces of evil, not persons doing evil, understanding that individual forms of violence happens within a context of systemic violence. And in nonviolence, we're always looking for the root cause, while leaving space for personal accountability, because personal accountability is part of the healing journey for all people who are caught up in harm, including the people who caused harm. Just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to run through these next three, starting with principle 4, accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. A bit of a mouthful. This is an image, famous image from Bloody Sunday in Selma, where nonviolent protesters were attacked violently by the state police. And because of their commitment and training, they were able to maintain nonviolence in the face of this incredible form of violence. And this image paints a very clear picture of who's on the right side of justice. And that narrative is one of the most powerful weapons that we have in nonviolence, that when we are able to use nonviolence and maintain a commitment to that, it exposes the violence of these violent systems, right? And that narrative is really important, and it's what wins support. I'm really bad at remembering numbers, so I may be slightly off, but I believe that on Bloody Sunday, there were about 600 marchers. And then this happened. This image went out into the newswire, and within a couple of days, there were 2,000 people. And then within a few weeks, when they reinitiated the march that ultimately they were able to complete, there were like 6,000 people who finished that march, right? It's these images that wakes up the conscience of a nation and helps nonviolent movements become even larger. And there's also this more modern image of a woman named Aisha Evans, who was at a Black Lives Matter protest after the police murder of Alton Sterling. There's so much that I could say about this image, but the thing that I want to talk about just for right now is there's something about acceptance in this image. Oftentimes, like when we go to protests, I see people holding up shields and throwing bottles at the police. And there's something about like knowing that when we go into a demonstration, we might get arrested, we might get tear gassed. And when we're holding up shields, we're resisting that reality. And I'm a big fan of tattoos. I got a lot of tattoos. When you get tattoos, you have a tendency to tighten your muscle, right? It's natural. But when you tighten your muscles, it actually hurts more. When you're able to breathe deeply and just accept that this is going to hurt, it hurts a little bit less. And there's something about the way Aisha Evans is showing up in this image, where there's just acceptance of what's going to happen to her. And to me, when we're able to accept the suffering that is oftentimes inevitable as part of movements, whether it's a violent movement or a nonviolent movement, when you're able to accept the suffering, it changes your relationship to it. And it makes it less likely that that suffering is going to percolate inside your body as internal violence of the spirit. Principle 5 is avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. I notice oftentimes when we go into movement spaces and we're not able to accept that it may be difficult for us, then it begins to internalize and metastasize in our body as resentment and internal violence of the spirit. Internal violence of the spirit can manifest as many things. It can manifest as hopelessness, desperation, negative self-talk. And these things may not feel so heavy at first. Like this bottle of water, which weighs a pound when it's full of water, a pound is not that heavy. You can hold it outstretched in front of you for, a few minutes and it's not that heavy. But the longer you hold on to that bottle, the heavier it's going to get. And that's how internal violence is. Like that desperation, that hopelessness might not feel that heavy at first, but the longer you hold on to it, the heavier it becomes. And also, these two beautiful quotes, again, from Dr. King, who says, "I have chosen to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." And a quote that comes out of the 12 Steps tradition that says, "Hating someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." That when you hold on to hatred and resentment and anger, that resentment actually hurts you more than it hurts the person that you're hating. And it's an act of violence that you're doing to yourself. So within this holistic understanding of nonviolence, I've come to believe that holding on to resentment and hating someone is an act of violence that I'm doing, not only to the person that I'm hating on, but more so to myself, right? And finally, the last principle of nonviolence, principle 6, is that the universe is on the side of justice. And I oftentimes talk about how I've come to believe that every time I hear about a young person getting shot and killed in the streets of Oakland, every time I hear about the newest mass shooting, every time I hear about the latest climate catastrophe, I've come to believe that that is evidence that the universe is on the side of justice. When you do a Google image search of the word justice, this is what you see. It's the scales, right? And there's a quote from Dr. King who once talked about how justice isn't about what's good, it's about balance. And when I see and I remember that justice is not about what's good and bad, because those are relative terms, but justice is about what's balanced, then to me, everything begins to make sense, because I look at all of the investments that we make as a society. As a society, we invest in violent video games and mass incarceration and war and militarization of the police. We invest in all of these forms of violence. And then when the universe gives us the return on those investments and we see more violence in our society, we act like something is wrong with the universe, when that's all we've been investing in. And so maybe if we as a society can begin to invest more into peace and into compassion and understanding, then maybe we'll see the return on those investments as well. When we invest in violence, it tips the scale, right? And oftentimes we think that when there's violence, it tips the scale. So in order to balance that, we need to hurt the other person. We need to hurt the person that caused us harm, and that will begin to balance the scale. But in reality, all that does is it adds more weight on the side of violence, and it tips the scale even further. And I believe that if violence happens, in order to balance the scale, we actually need to put more weight on the other side, right? More weight on the side of peace and love and understanding, as cheesy and as cliche as that might sound. That's how we bring balance back to the universe. And so I just want to close with these two quotes from two of the biggest influences perhaps in my life, Dr. Martin Luther King and the Buddha. Dr. King, who once said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." And the Buddha, in one of the opening lines of the Dhammapada, which is one of the most important texts in Buddhism, says, "Hatred never ceases through hatred in this world. Through love alone they cease. This is an eternal law." And I really come to understand nonviolence again, not simply as the absence of violence, but as our attempts at understanding these universal laws that govern our relationship to things like violence and harm and healing and peace. And so being a practitioner of nonviolence is about trying to better understand those universal laws and this unwavering commitment to moving one step closer to beloved community in every interaction that we have in life. And so there's a lot more to it that we can talk about, but grateful for this little bit of time to talk about my favorite subject. And yeah, I'll just pause there and would love to open it up for not just questions, but discussion. I know everyone here has lots of wisdom around this as well. So yeah, thank you all for that time. And yeah, I'll just open it up.
Wow, wow, wow. How about a round of applause for Kazu? That was so brilliant and beautiful and inspiring. And it's one of the best talks on nonviolence I've ever heard in my whole life.
Been blessed
Thanks,
with many great
Kazu.
teachers.
Great. So much to talk about. I could talk with you for weeks about all this. And so I'm going to ask if anybody has a question or comment. Maybe raise your hand like that or put the yellow thing up and I'll call on you. Otherwise, I'm going to start talking and nobody wants that. I know that. So let's see. Okay, Paula, we'll start with you and then Dave. And we've got a good half hour. And again, Kazu, thank you so much. It was brilliant and really, really helpful. So Paula and then Dave and then Tatanka. Go ahead and unmute. Yeah.
Sorry, I jumped you. Thank you, Kazu. I just want to thank you again because I chase you down wherever I see your name. And I mean, we live, real close. I'm in Berkeley, so I see you all the time. But what I wanted to point out, there's so many things I could say, but the thing that, really stood out from the very first time I met you or heard you was how you would talk about the trauma that was involved, not only in the events, the violence that occurred and the victims of the obvious violence, but the trauma that was existing in the people who were trying to live a nonviolent life, and so the universality and the experience in our community, in our world of that trauma and how that plays, so much. You did a beautiful job with those examples of the police officers and that. And so I want to thank you for bringing that to the fore, something that isn't talked about a lot, in just the superficial sort of nonviolence discussions. And I also wanted to thank you for starting your new program. It's really a beautiful thing. And I want to just tie it, not that I think Christianity is what it's all about or anything, but I do think that Jesus' story, regardless of whether you want to be Christian or not, Jesus' story is such a great example. And I like to use it no matter who I'm talking to, because when I talk with people about nonviolence or working for peace, they'll say, well, what do we need to do? And well, then the story of Jesus starts to come out, or at least as an example. We have to accept, we have to do things that may not look violent, but are very disruptive and may cause violence or certainly cause anger, but on the part of those with power or whatever. That's the whole story. I mean, I could go into it forever, but I mean, and then what will happen then to us is what we may have to accept the results of that. And that is so terrifying. Many people don't want to hear that, and then we'll pull back. The story of Jesus says, he tries to tell that story and people will say, oh, well, is there anything else I can do? And so I just wanted to kind of tie that and say that really it is the story. And the other story that I love is again, I don't know who first said it or whatever, but there's the story of the monk whose monastery has been taken over, and the may have been in Tibet, I'm not sure. And the army soldier who came up, all of the others had been killed or left, and he came up to the monk and said, aimed the gun at him and said, do you know, you should leave. I have the power to kill you with this rifle. And the monk stood there and said, that's right, but I also have the ability to stand here and let you do it. And that is that's the thing that I will work all my life. I don't have that. I don't have that yet after all this work. And then I'll just share one more thing. And that is something that, I know has been around, but something that I first heard when I met John Deere back with Pax Christi. It's that when the power of love outweighs the love of power is when we will have peace. So that goes back to that balancing. It's only when we have that, when we start putting that other investment in, is when we'll start getting that balance. And so I want to thank you for how many times have I heard those 6 messages, but you really do a beautiful job of applying them to our world. And I want to thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
Thank
there's a
you,
lot
Paula.
to what you said, but I just want to comment on one thing, because we were talking about this with John before the call, and I was talking about this just yesterday with another friend, that I grew up in a Japanese household, in a culture where Shintoism and Buddhism were the dominant paradigm. So I didn't grow up with any influence of the church. So my introduction to the church was when we were on the Middle Passage walk with those monks and nuns, and all of those churches let us stay there overnight. And it was through reading Walter Wink and Jesus and Nonviolence. And it was, I know the Church of the Brethren through my friend Matt Gwynn, who works with On Earth Peace and is a Kingian trainer. And I know about the Mennonites through my friend Tim Nafziger, who works with Christian peacemaker teams. And I know about the Methodists through my friend Marla Markram, who works with the Climate Disobedience Center. And so every time I hear about larger church systems, institutions, denominations making some decision, proclamation that goes against my understanding of Jesus's teachings, it's always like, wait, the Methodists did what? I thought the Methodists were all amazing, radical, like revolutionaries. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful to have met Jesus through the people that I've met Jesus through, So yeah, thank you for that.
That's great, Kazu. Thank you. And thank you so much, Paula. I'm laughing because I said that, 30 years ago when I was first sitting down with Thich Nhat Hanh, and I was complaining to him about the churches. And Kazu, he said most Buddhists were not nonviolent.
Mhm.
And then he started telling me all these terrible stories about Buddhists killing one another and supporting violence. And I was kind of relieved. I didn't know that. And now I've given talks to Buddhist communities in the United States, and they're working at the Pentagon, or they're building nuclear weapons, and they're Buddhists practicing mindfulness. So everybody's screwed up, and we're all on a journey, in my opinion. But I love your story, and it's really heartening to hear your experience as a Christian. And thank you, Paula. So I think, Dave, you had a comment or question, and go ahead for Kazu.
Okay. Kazu, thank you so much for that presentation. And like Paula, I never tire of listening to you, and I try to track you down and catch some of your your Zoom meetings and stuff. But I just want to comment that I think it's so important in the way you did it. I mean, I think we have to define the terms, and before we can really go on and develop the ideas and go into the deeper part of the theory. But I mean, nonviolence, versus non-hyphenated violence, peace being negative peace and positive peace. And then especially like the beloved community, I agree that that phrase has gotten watered down so much. And it just helps to listen to you explain what it really means, because it's so easy to forget what it actually means. And so I just want to thank you and encourage you to continue always defining the terms for the rest of us who are a little bit harder of understanding and letting it sink in. But I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave. And you might be interested to know that my colleague and one of my best friends, Chris Moore-Backman, who wrote a book called The Gandhian Iceberg, he comes more from a Gandhian tradition. It came from a Kingian tradition. But for years, we used to have a conversation about how the word nonviolence is just so riddled with misunderstandings that, especially with a lot of the communities that we work with, younger communities, marginalized communities, the word nonviolence has become almost a dirty word. And it's a conversation killer. And for a couple of years, we actually thought about, let's find a different word and stop calling it nonviolence. And ultimately, we decided not to do that because the word nonviolence just ties us immediately with such an important lineage that we felt like it was actually worth the effort to try to re-educate and reclaim the power of the word nonviolence. But yeah, we had that conversation for years because language really matters. And our understanding of these words are sometimes so drastically different. So yeah, I think it really is important to have these conversations.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you, Kazu. And thank you for that teaching about hyphenated nonviolence and all of it. You know, we've been doing this work, Kazu, for the last 6, 7, 10 years, Ken and I and our friends in the Vatican, trying to teach nonviolence in the Vatican. And we spent the first couple of years saying you can't use the hyphen. I don't know, what is your problem? And now we've got them. Pope Francis is using the word and he won't use the hyphen. And now and we're going back in December. We think they've picked it up. Can you do me a favor, make a note? I'm going to call on Tatanka, but can you send me the name and email of our friend who did the Kandian iceberg? I have a senior.
Sure.
I want to ask him to do a Zoom with. Yeah, I want to ask him to do a Zoom with us too. Or maybe you could send us both a Zoom then. Give me a plug that he might like to do this
I'm
with
also
us.
just sending you a private chat now with his email.
Okay, great. Very good. So Kazu, this is my friend Tatanka. Welcome, Tatanka, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Kazu. It was a wonderful teaching and on the 6 guiding principles. I'm really appreciative to hear again that all this individual violence sits within systemic violence. And I think it's one of the problems of the movement to make that leap and then to be able to assess whether it's any particular war that our country's involved in, whether it's, the massive denial of all the strategies, deny non-white people, young, older people the vote, whether it's the climate change issue. So I'd like to hear your thinking about perhaps some creative ways, or at least strategic ways, and pick any systemic thing you want to talk about. And what do you think we're missing as a movement, that where we can go at and as specifically as you want to talk, what would the action be that would provoke the response? Because as we know, King, why he chose, to go up against Bull Connor, he knew he was going to get that violent reaction, and it would be a teaching for the nation, and it did work. So I would love to hear your thinking on that.
Yeah, sure, thank you. I'll say a couple of quick things. One is I think so much of it is actually less about the what we do when we're in action spaces and more about how we're preparing for it. Like one of my most important mentors in this work is Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who got his start in the Nashville movement. And the leaders of the Nashville movement received nonviolence trainings under the guidance of Reverend James Lawson that lasted almost 6 months before they did their first demonstration. Right. And, the name, the East Point Peace Academy, is a play on words of the military academy at West Point. Right. Because I really believe that we need to prepare for nonviolence as much as the military prepares for violence. Right. And so I think in a lot of the movements today, the commitment to training and preparation has really just kind of disappeared. Like, if anything, there's like here's a 1-hour nonviolence training right before we go into the streets, come join us, and not this like commitment to an ongoing practice. And I think when you view nonviolence as like a martial art or a meditation and you're practicing on a regular basis, I think it does something to our bodies, to our psyches, that when we show up in the front lines, we're able to do creative things that opens up possibilities for healing in ways that are just not even imaginable. I forgot if it was Paula who was just sharing that story, but it reminded me of another story of friend and mentor who many of you probably know, David Hartso, who's got the story of when he was in the sit-in movement when he was young, and he was sitting at the lunch counter, and a member of the KKK was holding a knife almost at his throat. And he said, "End lover, you have 3 seconds to get up and leave this lunch counter, or I'm going to shove this knife into your throat." And David looked him in the eye and stood up and said, "Brother, you do what you need to do, and my job is to love you regardless." Something like that, right? Like, that's only, that's transformative. B, it was effective, it kept him alive. And C, it's only possible because David had already been preparing and training in nonviolence, right? And cultivating that love. And so I think the preparation is critical. And I think related to that preparation is a lot of our movements today, I'm afraid, has become, as a friend of mine says, the tactics that we use have become frozen in time. Like, maybe there were tactics that, like during the civil rights movement, it was revolutionary, the idea of packing the jails. And it would cause so much pressure on the system and they didn't know how to handle it. Now, the police can arrest 500 people and it's business as usual, right? They know exactly how to prepare for that. So I think we've lost some of our creativity and we just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. I think the idea of like occupying random highways is not as effective as being really strategic and thinking about strategic targets. So like in the movement for Black Lives, I would love for us to think about the next police academy and trying to shut down the police academy as opposed to just taking over a random highway. So I think there's a lot of things around preparation and strategy that I see is missing a lot of our movements today.
Thank you. Thank you. We know the story of Rosa Parks. She wasn't naive.
Exactly.
She came out of Highlander. We know how important it is. And that story of David is a wonderful story. I know it saved my life twice in the Farm Workers Union, just the training we have. And I want to mention to people that when I was with a group of, with the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence that went up to talk to Caesar, because Ira Sampearl wanted to talk to him about establishing an ongoing institute, an ongoing, study thing. Basically, Caesar's point of view was, we have one. It's the picket line. It's because they had a long view, and they just, and there was a lot of wisdom in that, because people learned so much just showing up and taking part in a strike and taking part in a picket line. But there's no substitute for what you're talking about, and the developing of a community of nonviolence that does all this practice. And then one person has an idea and then the action comes, because you're studying it and you're studying the preparation. So thank you for that. It's a way of life. That's what the way of life is about.
Thank you so much, Tatanka, and thank you so much, Kazu. I'm going to be bold and call on myself now. Sorry, everybody. And then I'll call on Johnny and Jim. It's all so beautiful and so exciting to me. And Tatanka, you remind me that, Cesar Chavez, I'm trying to look for you, chastised me for writing too much about nonviolence and giving too many talks about nonviolence. It's like 1990. Can you imagine, Kazu? You haven't lived until you be chastised. And he's saying, he said what, Kazu, did you know Gandhi said he has nothing to do with conferences? Gandhi would never go to a peace conference or not. And Cesar Chavez was kind of saying that too. He was saying it's all on the streets and the front lines. That's nonviolence. It was so helpful to me. I want to make 3 points. The first is a point, and the second are kind of questions leading up to the third, which is about the accepting of suffering, as a question for you, Kazu. So the first, I just thank you about the Dr. King's sermon on peace. I've forgotten all about that. I got to go back and study that. It's really helpful to use as a teaching today. Second of all, so the phrase, the beloved community, I've been trying to figure it out. And I've been studying Dr. King since I was 8 years old. So here's my take on it. for your reflection, Kazu, the problem as for the Christian peacemaker is that Jesus, and you may or may not know this, Jesus never talked about himself. It's very strange. And that's what happens. Christianity has made an idol of Jesus. He's talking morning, noon, and night about something called the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is at hand. Well, Gandhi then said the kingdom of God is nonviolence, which is revolutionary. This is something Jim Lawson and I still talk about a lot. Well, a lot of people over the last 60 years, and Martin Luther King would be one of them, and Dorothy Day and the Berrigans and Thomas Merton all stopped talking about kingdom of God. And certainly as women and feminism came into the church, they said you can't use that phrase because it's sexist, it's king language and so forth. And there's a real problem. It's the language question again. So Dr. King is using this old FOR phrase, the beloved community, which is now totally misunderstood. Now, and I you can respond to this if you'd like. The very first time I was with Coretta Scott King, she said at the March on Washington, I was a small group of us, she said, Martin and I saw the beloved community. There's 250,000 people there, but they were black and white marching for jobs, peace, and freedom. We never thought that would happen in our lives. And till the day Martin died, it was a vision. It was the promised land that he spoke of. That's interesting. I don't think of it that way. I think of the beloved community as this kingdom of God or the reign of God, which is like your phrase of the North Star. So it's eschatological nonviolence, a whole new world of nonviolence, which we can't even imagine. That's what Jesus is talking about. It's also the same as Buddha, the Pure Land. So any thoughts on that? And then secondly, I wanted to ask about step number 3. Kazu, you're the first person in 40 years I've known who's talked about step 3. When I read everything I could on Dr. King and Gandhi. And my submission is that every single day of their lives, in every single talk on nonviolence that Gandhi and King talked about, they said we have to accept suffering in the struggle for justice. And nobody says that today. Nobody. So I really wrestled with this in the 80s. It was partly why I went to live in El Salvador and went to jail. Okay. And I was trying to teach myself, I'm going to accept suffering. Jesus said, take up the cross. But the key is I'm not going to retaliate. And Charlie McCarthy added, you're not going to have a trace of the desire for retaliation. And it's all in the struggle for justice. We're not talking about women being abused by men and so forth. You know, we're talking about the struggle. You accept. Well, so I talked about that for 12 years. And this is what I want to see what you think about. And then, Kazu, I stopped talking about it because I'm mainly talking to comfortable white church people in the United States, and they just could not hear it. Now, Dr. King speaking to brutalized African Americans, Gandhi to oppressed Indians, and I'm still struggling with this question. And yet, for me, it's at the heart of the whole thing. It's all the Catholic saints are about this, like Therese of Lisieux, St. Francis, accept suffering. It's at the heart of Thich Nhat Hanh in Buddhism. Yeah. It's how do you teach nonviolence? And I know it depends on the audience, but until we are willing and open to give our lives and accept suffering without a trace of the desire for retaliation, I don't think I think we're all totally clueless about nonviolence and Jesus and Buddha. I really wanted to share these because Kazu is my teacher of nonviolence, and I need some help with this. So help me, Kazu.
Certainly a reciprocal road. First of all, I once had a conversation with Reverend James Lawson, who was like, don't train for the sake of training, train for action. Like you're training to send people out into the streets. So I think we're all receiving similar messages there. Yeah, you know, in terms of the sacrifice and the suffering part, my experience has been that this is the trickiest principle to talk about, particularly when in diverse groups and communities with people who have already suffered so much, I think to them it comes off as like, wait, you're asking me to suffer even more? And part of it, like I've heard a lot of elders from the civil rights movement say this, is like, wait a second, we were suffering anyways, right? Like as Black people in the South, there's no way to move through life without suffering. So is there a way to make that suffering optional, or not optional, but to have some agency and say, we're going to choose to accept this as a way to move us through it and to get us closer to our goals. So I think there's some acknowledgement that suffering is happening anyways. And a lot of what we're talking about these days in particular is with this impending climate crisis that is only going to get worse and worse. The scale of suffering that our species are going to experience over the next 50 years, I think, is unimaginable. And a lot of the work that we do, we're framing it as we're training ourselves, we're preparing ourselves for what is inevitable. By choosing to accept suffering, even in our own trainings and going through difficult experiences, we're building up our muscles and our capacity to accept something that is like just around the corner. And the more we can prepare for it, the more we can be grounded when it happens. Like we're doing a lot of this around like a trauma healing framing, and knowing that when we are activated and when our trauma is triggered and our emotions are activated, nonviolence is less accessible to us. Right? The part of our brain that is responsible for empathy and compassion and nuance, that gets cut off when we're triggered. And so the more we can ground ourselves and heal from our traumas and practice being in difficult triggering places, the more we can be grounded when it matters most. And that kind of training, that kind of preparation, that kind of trauma healing feels horrendous sometimes, right? Like a lot of the trauma healing that I've done around looking at my own childhood traumas is some of the most painful experiences that I've ever been through in my life, but it's made me stronger and less likely to be activated, right? So I think a lot of the framing that we're doing around the sacrifice and the suffering piece is like, we just have to be ready for what's coming.
That's brilliant. Really, really helpful. Anything else?
For me or for someone else? I can
From
keep
you,
going forever,
from you on any of these thoughts.
Well, I'll just say on what you mentioned about beloved community too. I think it's a bit of an and or, because I sometimes talk about the nonviolence workshops that we host and spaces like that. It's like being a time machine. Like we're able to fast forward 250 years into the future to get a taste in our bodies of what beloved community could feel like. So we have a better sense of what the North Star looks like, right? So I think there are moments where I'm in community spaces that are doing incredible healing work, and I feel like, oh, this is beloved community. But then I step out of that and know, oh, that was just a time machine. That was just a taste, so that we have a better sense of what's possible.
That's lovely. Thank you. I said Johnny and then Jim next. Would that be okay, Tatanka?
Yeah, it's fine. Just 20 seconds at the end.
Okay. Johnny. Go ahead and
okay. Am I coming in all right?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would say, John, if you go on a book tour, please take Kazu with you and do a joint book tour anytime you go out on a book tour. My question is, just recently joined New Jersey Peace Action as a board member. I've volunteered before for 20 years, but and I feel like the elephant in the room is, how do we, I don't know if this has been your experience, Kazu, in certain fields of activism, but how do we bridge the gap between the older and younger generation? I feel sometimes it tends to be quite tribal, and I've been part of a younger generation where I've participated, and then an older generation, but haven't seen like an integration of both as much as I would hope for. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's definitely a challenge. I'm really glad that this cohort that we just launched, we're putting 30 people through a 6-month cohort meeting every week, is very intergenerational. But it's a tough one. When I started getting involved in a lot of youth justice work in the mid 2000s or so, it was a lot of amazing work empowering young people, but it was with this understanding that like young people have everything they need to do it on their own. And there's an element of truth in that, but what's missing is that no, they actually also need guidance from the elders, right? And like being in Occupy movement, which was a lot of young people, it was really sad for me to see so many strategies that were developed by the Clamshell Alliance and all these things that they didn't like, young people didn't even realize that we were being influenced by these older generations, right? And so I think a lot of it is telling the stories of like the radical militant movements that we've all been influenced by in ways that we don't even understand, right? Like a lot of the decentralized movement work was pioneered by Clamshell Alliance, right? And so like understanding the history, but also for a lot of what I hear from young people who are frustrated by elders from the movement is that a lot of elders from the movement did amazing work back in the day, and these days only talk about the amazing work that they did in the day and aren't engaged on the front lines in the way that, you know, some elders, Cornell West and Joanne Sheehan, who was my first nonviolence trainer, is still like deeply in grassroots communities. And so I think to really lift up the voices of elders who are actually still in the work, right? Because they are there, and those people, they have the respect of the young people because they see them every day. And so I think, you know, people like, I'm 41 now, so I feel like I oftentimes have the ability to play the bridge building role. And so people of our generation really being explicit about that role as well is important. But I think so much of it's just about story sharing and storytelling.
Thank you very much, Johnny, and thank you, Kazu. So Jim Crosby, welcome from Texas. Go ahead and
Thanks,
unmute.
John. Thank you. And Kazu, thank you. And I want to throw you a softball. We've talked so much about wonderful phrases and words, and I just wanted to give you a chance to riff a little bit on the phrase fierce vulnerability that I know you've been working with.
So much. Yeah, so fierce vulnerability is actually the word that we were almost going to replace nonviolence with. But we decided to continue to use nonviolence, but this word fierce vulnerability that my friend Chris and I had been playing around with for a little while just took on a life of its own. And it's now the name of our most popular workshop at East Point. It's the name of my next book. And it's the name of this national network that we helped to build called the Fierce Vulnerability Network, which is a national decentralized direct action movement working at the intersection of climate justice and racial healing with a deep commitment to integral nonviolence. And for me, fierce vulnerability, you know, I'm obviously writing 300 pages on what I think it means, but I think a lot of it is bringing in a deep understanding of how trauma works into social change work. Both how it works on a personal level, how trauma works in my body and how that then affects the health of movements, but also understanding how collective trauma works and learning to regulate our collective emotional nervous systems. But also, you know, we talk about what would it look like if we viewed nonviolent direct action as a modality of collective trauma healing? And what would it look like if we moved into direct action spaces with, like, tactically, we may shut down a highway, but spiritually, energetically, we're actually there to open things up, because direct action culture has this, like, we're here to shut things down worldview. And just the last thing I'll share is, you know, Michael Nagler, another elder in this work, is the first person that first taught me that in nonviolence, as the level of violence escalates, we need to escalate the level of nonviolent response to that violence, right? So it's an appropriate response. But in my experience, what I've noticed is that the more we escalate our tactics of nonviolent resistance, the more we escalate this us versus them, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys worldview. And again, to me, that's the worldview that is at the heart of what is destroying this planet. So fierce vulnerability is largely about, like, how do we regulate our emotions enough so that we can use these escalated tactics to meet the urgency of the moment while being grounded enough to remember our interdependence to each other. So a lot more I could say to fierce vulnerability, but thank you, Jim, for giving me that little assist there.
Thank you so much, Jim. Now, Kazu, thank you. And how about doing a Zoom with us when your book comes out on fierce vulnerability?
Yeah. That.
So we'll all let you teach us again next year. And Kazu, is there a way people can contact you to invite you to speak or anything like that? What's your website, or can you
The
type
website
anything
is
in?
eastpointpeace.org. Yeah, I'll put it into the chat. And my email is just kazu@eastpointpeace.org. So eastpoint.org.
Okay.
is the-
Tatanka, you had
Oh,
a brief comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that a famous quote of Cesar Chavez, when you were talking about suffering, is he has a quote, "To be a man is to suffer
Yeah.
for others." And the key is others. The key is others. When I was organizing Amnesty International, I came in contact with people all over the world, Brazil, who had suffered intense torture. Their commitment, they had no resentment at the torture, but they were absolutely committed. It will never happen. So, and the survivors of people, young people gunned down now, Black people, the families, it's willingness to suffer for others, willing to do what is ever. And the last thing is when somebody was mentioning bridging the gap between older and younger. I mean, I'm still very active, and it's been a question of mine. So I have spent time with the Sunrise Movement, and during COVID, it's more difficult because we're not in person, but I just do what they want me to do as a supporter. So I'm showing up to make phone calls for AOC and for Levin and for all these people. And then when we meet in person, like at the CARB or in the state capitol working on climate change, and they see me there shutting down the California Air Resources Board, and we connect, and I'm the one that was on the phone, that's how it happens. It happens when we meet in person, but just meeting them on their terms, because they want to prove that they can do this, but they love our stories, absolutely love our stories.
Thank you, Tatanka. Paula, did you have a quick comment? Because we're out of time.
Yeah, no, I just wanted
Very
to
brief.
just bring back what you said about David Hartsell, because when I talked before, I was talking about the focus on, you know, the answer, what we should do is to be willing to accept suffering. But David starts everything with how he loved. He loved, and he did what he did out of love. And that really is the start. So of course, if we do our work, what you said, the preparing, the work is learning to love ourselves, learning to love others is where the rest will come from. So I just wanted to bring that up again. There's a lot
That's
more I want to
beautiful,
say,
and
but that's it.
happy note to end on. The challenge is love, universal nonviolent love. Kazu, it's been a pleasure and an honor to hear you, and thank you. How about a big round of a show of hands to our teacher, Kazu. So it was great. Thank you, and brilliant. And I feel energized and inspired. Just a little 2-second commercial here. So our next Zoom is on November 12th with Martha Hennessy. She's Dorothy Day's granddaughter, and she's going to talk about her grandmother and stories about her and what she learned about nonviolence and solidarity with the poor from her grandmother. And as you know, Martha recently spent a couple of years in prison with the Kings Bay Plowshares. So she's going to be talking about nonviolence too. A week later, Carolyn, who you see there on the Zoom, she's here, wave your hand. Carolyn is doing the rescheduled Zoom she was going to do last month. So on Saturday, November 19th, Carolyn Whitney Brown is doing a Zoom on Henry Nouwen, based on Carolyn's new book about Henry and the spirituality of the circus as an image of nonviolence, which is what Henry wrote to me about 30 years ago. So that's great. Yeah, my book, The Road to Peace. Carolyn's a real close friend of Henry Nouwen. So if you like Henry Nouwen and you haven't registered, please join us. Carolyn's father died. All our condolences to Carolyn. So that's why we had to postpone and reschedule the Zoom. So I hope to see you there. If you haven't signed up for it, please do. The next Zoom after that is Saturday, December 3rd with Maria Stefan. I hope you know her, Kazu. Oh, you're friends.
Yeah, we actually work pretty
her.
closely these days. Yeah.
Oh, good. And she's the co-author with Erica Chenoweth. Now, you're not going to believe me because you all on to me how bombastic I am, but she may be the world's expert on global nonviolent conflict resolution. Kazu, would you agree?
Yeah, she's amazing. And the work she's doing
She's
to bridge
amazing.
peace building and nonviolent action work
Yeah,
is
all around the world. She speaks at the United Nations and the state departments all over the world. And she's my friend through the work at the Vatican. and with Erica Chenoweth. So she's going to talk about global nonviolent resistance and organizing right now. And that means, first of all, the Ukraine and Russia and NATO. Friends, I mean, you want to hear the leading expert on all of this, please sign up. Now, you know, Kazu and I are activists. You know, it'd be great to have you sign up. It'd be greater if you could get 10 more people to sign up, because I mean, it's not often that Maria does a workshop for ordinary people, but she's a friend of mine and Kazu, so she wouldn't miss this. But I really think we should have 150 people listening to Maria Stepan. That will only happen if you can help me spread the word, and you'll be getting e-blasts. Send it out to all your lists and whatever you can do to help. The next day, I will be flying to Rome for the next meeting on nonviolence at the Vatican, so wish us luck. I have great programs lined up through May 20th, Kazu, when Cornell West is going to do a Zoom with me. And Cornell said, I don't know if you know, Dr. West, he he said, I'm not giving a talk. I need to get down and dirty with John about nonviolence, about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and then he starts this. So it's going to be a thing, and I can't wait. And so please come, and Kazu, you're welcome to join any of these Zooms. Just write to me, okay? And then as long as you'll do one in the future. So how about we'll just have a 2-second blessing, and then I'll just say thank you to everybody. So dear friends, may the God of peace, who loves each one of us, bless us abundantly with peace and strengthen us to be practitioners and teachers and saints and prophets and apostles of loving, creative nonviolence to the world. And I bless you all in the name of peace. Go forward and be teachers of peace and nonviolence. Thank you very much, Kazu. I'll sign off now. And Kazu, be well, get well,
John,
and
thank you,
see
everyone.
everybody next time. Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.